Thank you. So we jump right into the discussion, and yes.
Can I start? I promise I'll keep this extremely brief, but I do have questions for all three. So first of all, thank you for these presentations. What a really stimulating panel. I'm going to ask them very quickly. Austin, the thing that comes to mind during your presentation, at least as co-Americans here, right, living through a milieu that's rather concerning, is the overlaps and differences between Christianity and Christian nationalism. I want you to comment on that if you can. And the same between Christian nationalism and fascism. If we can have maybe your thoughts in regard to that spectrum, that would be really great. Robert, you and I share a view in kind of two macro contexts for thinking about fascism that I think is a useful conversation for this conference, the outcome of this conference, which is the sort of, fascism as a symptom or a response or reaction to industrial modernity on the kind of smaller macro scale, but in the larger, the kind of inter-imperial world historical contexts for the emergence of fascism. That's something that came to mind at the end of your presentation. I wonder if you can offer us some thoughts on that. I think that might be the direction, one of the directions in which this field might need to head. And I have two questions for Amy. I'll make really, really brief. The first one is, you've spoken about the cult of martyrs on the right. But as you know, and as many of us know in this room, the Anni di Piombo produced many martyrs on both sides of the spectrum, right? The far left, the militant far left, the Operaio, Potere Operaio, and other groups, along with the MSI martyrs and the Fronte della Gioventù. So if you could talk a little bit about the political culture of martyrdom and commemoration on the far left, out of the context of the Anni di Piombo, that'd be great. And the second question is, and I wish Enzo, are you here? I didn't spot him. I was hoping he would be here because his presentation on post-fascism, I think, is relevant to your presentation in that you're thinking about this sort of Geertzian minkiness, right, of the Italian far right in regards to its participation. I think, Terrence also commented on this as well. Its participation within a clear politics of fascist commemoration, and yet with a kind of plausible deniability of a kind of liberal normality. The Fratelli and other groups like Lega would like themselves to be cloaked in. So if you could maybe, if you have time, comment on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will also take the question of Paul and Jen, and then I give you and then we have other questions. So Paul,
yeah, thanks. I have a question for Austin,
yeah.
And you can take this as a comment if you like, and talk to me later or answer it if you like. But I'm interested in the kind of social background of what you're talking about, specifically in the present. The Christianity and the religiosity of the far right is coming into focus now, at a moment when, it seems that the kind of general evangelical Christian movement, Christian America is sort of, beginning to fray a little bit in its organizational kind of religiosity. I mean, it's politically powerful still, but the religious sort of churches behind it are sort of getting ever more diffuse. And, when I think about the analogous groups in Europe, Pew reports show the secularization of Europe is sort of continuing, and even in Poland, the religiosity, markers of religiosity are down. So I guess I'm curious, sort of, who are the people who are really embracing this, and how and why are they not finding what they want in sort of the larger evangelical world? I mean, there's a Catholic dimension to it.
My question's for Austin also. And I thought, thinking along with Ned Blackhawk, how useful is it for us to use the nation as the frame for North American far rights if we think about religion as connected to white supremacy and settler colonialism? So should we think in terms of Turtle Island versus US religious far right activism? And what about the internationalism of North American far rights? Not that I want to claim him, but Father Coughlin was born in Hamilton, Ontario, and then moved to the US, and his radio plays were also broadcast out of Detroit, which is a short walk I know because my uncles worked the Ambassador Bridge. So that, thinking about settler colonialism, mediatization, far rights, and trans-border activism.
So first round, and then
I'll be very quick. As far as overlaps between Christianity, Christian nationalism, and fascism, to Brian's point, Christian nationalism Well, now people are claiming that label for themselves, but initially that was just a term invented by scholars to describe what they found, I think, is an embarrassing vestigial of a type of religiosity that shouldn't exist in a modern secular world anymore, and a way to distance themselves as evangelicals, which most of them are, from that milieu and say, this is something wrong. Did you notice that 82% of white evangelicals voted for Trump? That's not us. And so it's complicated, but I'm very hesitant to use that as an actual historical term. And we can talk more about the relationship between that and fascism later, because I'm going to go quickly. Paul, I think you pointed something out that's very similar to Brian's point, which is that this a lot of this statistics and data about the de-churching and the lack of losing religiosity has to do purely, in my view, with a problem when you're gathering data. If you correlate religiosity to church attendance and church attendance alone, yes, it's going to seem like religiosity is disappearing in the United States and secularism is taking over. And yet we also know that people are moving to online spaces. We also know that people are not going, and this is not just post-COVID, but even before that. So where are they finding religiosity now is a very good question. I'd love to talk more about that maybe over dinner. And then, Jen, to your point, the international aspect, 100% yes. And I think that's what's really interesting, particularly about the American Catholic far right, in the sense that these, building off of Julia Comidis's work, that there's this international crusade, as she calls it, right? That it is not just Italian, it is not just French, but it is, in fact, there are Americans involved, and it's also through this international body, the mystical body of Christ, but this international body of the Catholic Church, in which they are all connected together, again, through the incarnation. And so, of course, Coughlin, it doesn't, the United States to him is, again, has this role, perhaps, with, in fighting communism. But it, again, yeah, absolutely, that's my point. It is not the end all be all. America is just an instrument for fighting communism.
Let's start with a response to the comment. Thank you, Terrence, for your thoughts on our papers and for bringing them together. Do they care? I think no. I've had the misfortune of attending an event held at Casa Pound to observe these kind of commemorative rituals. And it was an event. My book is about an attack on a far-right family that happened in Primavalle in Rome in 73 and killed two children, well, a 22-year-old and a child, of an MSI, local leader. And I attended this book launch that was held to launch a book written by someone who had been a member of the MSI in the 70s and had written his reflections on both the political violence of the 70s and then this perceived kind of double injustice of the lack of judicial kind of clarity and justice that kind of follows the years of lead. And I was fascinated to watch the difference in the audience, which was primarily composed of two sets of people. The first were people who had been alive in the 1970s and engaged in far-right political violence, and then there's a big gap, and then the second is a kind of very young male group of kind of 20-year-olds-ish. And when they were discussing the actual facts of the Rogo di Primavalle, the kind of younger group of men were less interested. But when they turned to this younger group and said, you are the future, it's your duty to take on this kind of custody of memory and to bring that into the future, and they very much present commemoration as an act of political militancy, a sort of non-violent version of what they were up to before, and they kind of validate it, bravi ragazzi, alzatevi, and they do all of this stuff. Then there's kind of engagement. So there's really interesting kind of affective sort of transmission going on there between the generations. But I'm not necessarily sure that the younger generation actually really are interested in the history, but more about positioning themselves as part of an ongoing new kind of political front. Brian's question on far-right versus left-wing martyrs. I guess I'll differentiate a little bit here between state martyrs, left-wing state martyrs, which is like a whole other thing, and there's some really interesting work by Baldassare Scolari, who was written about commemoration of state martyrs as part of the construction of Italy's new civil religion, and how the values for which martyrs, state representatives died, are being bound up in what it means to be a kind of citizen today, member of the Italian Republic. But if we're talking about kind of individuals, members of grassroots groups, Yeah, that's a really interesting question. In many ways, they share the commemorative culture shares some qualities. I'm always astonished when I see plaques that both for the far right and the kind of left-wing victims, where the language is so heavily rooted in the fascist, anti-fascist kind of rhetoric that you saw during the Ventennio. So I'm thinking of the death of Valerio Verbano, who was part of Autonomia Operaio and killed in 1980, and the plaque that commemorates him describes him as like partigiano, etc. So there's the kind of continuity of that historic kind of tradition of resistance through political militancy. But I think where it's really different is the place for grief. The historic fascist regime, you could grieve if you were a mother or a wife or a survivor of some attack under fascism that killed your male relative. You could grieve if it was kind of contained and if you honoured nevertheless the sacrifice in the name of the national project. It was kind of like patriotic grief. Hannah Malone's work's really interesting on this. But there's no room for actual grief. Whereas, as mentioned by Elissa, I'm working on memory of Giacomo Matteotti internationally, and I think that grief is political currency at that time, and we can think about kind of networks of compassion that emerge in anti-fascist communities around the world, diasporic communities, or in Europe, founded on the kind of public expression of grief and kind of shared ideas of grief. The other important thing, and then I'll pass on to Robert, is the role of persecution within these stories. And I think that the far right, Almirante tried to act as civil plaintiff and kind of join the prosecution in the case against those who perpetrated the Rogo di Primavalle. So the MSI tried to insert itself judicially and kind of ritualistically into these very private tragedies that happened on people's families, to present these attacks as part of a broader persecution of a kind of powerful but small minority in the anti-fascist republic. And we really see that idea of persecution being kind of the lifeblood of the far right now, I think, right? They sort of thrive on it. So I'm going to slightly dodge the question on post-fascism. I prefer to use neo-fascism, or neo-fascisms, because of this idea of like constant evolution. I don't think it's just post-fascism and it kind of stops there and it's something entirely new. I think there are really interesting continuities, differences, and evolutions that come on time and time again. Do you want to just come here?
All right, thank you very much, Brian and Terry too. I guess I'll take the question from Brian first and say that yes, I agree. I think this again, one of the most striking things perhaps about the sort of new order, the vision of world order in Mussolini's Italy is its rurality, right? And it's that's in a sense one thing that sort of distinguishes it, I think, from Nazism, insofar as there's a sense in which the sort of core would remain, at least to some extent, rural as well as industrial, and then the sort of periphery would be sort of made of all of these sort of quite modern kinds of plantations, right? And this is the other thing, is the other piece, is that it's not just the rurality, it's the modernity of it. Of course, our friend Diana has written a lot about it, but you could see it on a broader scale too, right? And again, in the sense the sort of division of labor, the international division of labor that I've just described is not altogether different, right, than the one we find in the European Union, or for that matter, anywhere in the world today, between North and South, in which we all, if we live in Europe or the United States, live in these kind of big, bulked out, subsidized, and in one sense protected sort of states which produce all of our grain, bread, at home, and then farm out the rest to the global South. And so I think I think we're in agreement there, for sure. Now I think I'll just that kind of brings me to the question that Terry raised, which is I think the answer is there within the question itself, but the focus on a broader group of actors, what it tells us about foreign policy, fascism, the diversity, right, of actors, of ideas. I think there's a sort of virtue, perhaps, of that in and of itself. But I think it also, again, I think for me, points us to the interests as well as the ideas there in Parliament. That is the economic interests, right, behind foreign policy, and what those interests might tell us about how that policy changes over time. Again, I sort of talked about this moment, right, in 1924, 1926, in which the sort of plow in the bow comes together there in the legislature. And of course, that coincides with these kind of massive shift in the foreign policy of fascist Italy in 1926, in which Mussolini goes to North Africa, the first prime minister to do so, president of the Council of Ministers, to do so. And then they kick out a lot of the career diplomats and embark on this much more ambitious, I think, foreign policy. And so, again, I think it would point us again to the interests, to perhaps the structures as well as the intentions of foreign policy.
Okay, so I take a second round. It's Renato Moro, then Diana and Mary, and then I take a third round, and I think I will. Okay.
I have a question for Austin, a question for Robert, and a comment for comment. The question for Austin is there any trace of this long anti-state North American libertarian tradition in the past and present U.S. far right? Robert, thanks for the panel. It was fascinating. My question comes from interest, of course. I think very interesting, this view of Mussolini's global view, new and interesting. The lenses of ideology. There is an instance in which I think that they are revealing. After Pearl Harbor, it was fascist Italy that declared war to the US. And there is a trace of a dialogue between Mussolini and one of the major Italian industrialists, who said, well, Duce, how is it not possible that you do not think, you do not know the power, the industrial power of the US? It is enough to look at the phone book of the city of New York. And the answer was, I'm not afraid. The future is young people, those are old peoples, the Americans are bad, worse than the British or the French, because they are the mixture of all this evil in the European tradition. Fortunately, he was totally wrong about the power of technology, industrialism. He lost his war. But the lenses of ideology are, I think, an integrating part of this vision of the world over. And on Amy, very interesting, I totally share. Do you remember, I have debated with Enzo Traverso on the problem of post-fascism, and Fratelli d'Italia is exactly a case in which we are in between, at least, in this tradition between fascism and post-fascism. Casa Pound is fascist, without any doubt. I would only to add this. In order to understand this Italian tradition, we have to remember that Italy has been the country in the world with the largest communist party and the largest fascist party. But because you have to remember that after the war, after the Holocaust, 7, 8, 9% of Italians, according to the elections, voted for a clearly radical, because it was not only fascist, the regime, it was Slav, that is, it was the more radical expression of fascism that these Italians were voting. This is a fact, it's the consequences continue to last.
Thank you. So there's a bit of change of scenery because our commander-in-chief, Sky, he said we should...
It was too long.
No. It's, I'm going to take all your questions and comments, but I would like to ask you to be very brief, and then I give each of you a very short, final statement. So now it's Diana, then Mary, Roberta, Atina, and Rafael.
So first, thanks for an amazing panel. This was really a pleasure to listen to. My question is for Amy regarding commemoration as performance. Clearly, they picked their stage very carefully. They showed up in costume, and they even followed a script. So who is the audience? Who are they performing for?
Thank you. Mary?
A question for Austin. Then, in your interwar period as well as later, you sort of take undoubtedly authentically religious people at their word that what they care about is the kingdom of God. But as so often when people, they need to transform the state, and they can be equally concerned with the kingdom of God and really very interventionist in politics. And I think one difference between Europe is that the role of the Catholic Church and the Vatican is much more aware of that. A question for Amy. Are there tensions between what appeared to be a very masculine commemorative culture and a very, I couldn't tell from the photo, but it looked like very male men raising their arms, and Giorgia Meloni up there representing the institution? So are there women in the commemorative culture, and are there tensions between that? And for Robert, I agree that autarky is not, in fact, a description of what these regimes do, but the question is, how do we explain the use and when do people adopt the use of the vocabulary of autarky, protectionism, more isolation? Is it simply because they're reacting against a much more open global order? How does it function?
Thank you. Roberta.
Okay. What this panel really made me think of is the ways in which we try to find the fellow travelers and the enablers and those who seek to benefit from fascism, and in some there's the far right, but there's the right more broadly, and the connections between them. And so maybe in the interwar US, the far right is maybe not the place to look for these fellow travelers and stakeholders and so forth, and they actually found elsewhere in the economic leadership of the country and so forth. So I think that's something interesting to think about where exactly are these affinities across and within the really broad spectrum of what we call the right. And I think that also relates to the point that the presentation that Robert made about how do we think about these stakeholders in fascist foreign policy and what their goals were in relation to Mussolini and so forth. And for Amy, I'm just wondering what you make of the reaction of public opinion in Italy to these commemorations.
Thank you. Athena?
Yeah, thank you. Amy, as we listened to you, I was just wondering whether it would be interesting in terms of this question of sort of visibility, invisibility, sort of avowal, disavowal, to look at memory culture in Spain, which so just maybe some thoughts about that in terms of the whole history of the Spanish Civil War and then into the Franco period. And actually, my question is kind of for Terrence, except that then I was hoping that the panel could respond to Terrence because Elissa introduced you as a historian of also colonialism and decolonization. And I'm kind of, given our conversations, I'm so curious to see whether you have a brief, sort of perspective from that training and that teaching and that scholarship onto what we have heard.
Thank you, Athena.
Yeah, I have a question for Amy. Thank everyone, it was an excellent panel. My question is about the sense of place in the rituals and the circulation of iconography that you described, because it was surprisingly offline in many ways, and it looks like there is a very strong localism even to the neighborhood history and the very local memory. And so is there a relationship between that and the online, I guess, network and social life of the movement? And is there a specific strategy behind this behind this localism.
Okay.
So very short, and I
Space.
also give Terrence.
I might take Raffaele's question about space with Diana's because I think they're intimately connected because they are stages, aren't they? And if you can see like the commemoration of the Rogo di Primavera happens under the window at which the two sons of the MSI leader died. So it's all about reactivating these spaces of far-right persecution, right, in order to shine a spotlight on the antagonist and kind of underline that we are victims too, I think. As in the far right were victims too, right? So it's kind of debating this idea that like a fascist can't be a victim, which is thorny. Diana's one, in terms of who's the audience, I think it's such a fascinating question. I think there are many layers. There's just this week with Acalarencia, someone just came out of the apartments, right? So these take place underneath these condominiums. And this guy came out and said, you know, vive la Costituzione, vive l'antifascismo. And he got arrested, but these dudes didn't. So like, that ties into the question of public opinion, completely shocking. And I think Ellie Schleiner's really taken this up, and she's really pushing for like Meloni to sort of actually say, I am against the fascist salute, this is outrageous, etc. Not sure we've got there yet, but it's kind of, yeah, she's doing good work. But I also think the intended audience is photography. You know, you can see these photos, and to answer as well on place, you know, it is, I've looked at Rome, but there's also the Sergio Ramelli corteo that happens in Milan in these big wide boulevards that, you know, often constructed by the fascist regime for that very purpose of public spectacle and kind of declarations of might. And the optics, sometimes I'm not sure if I'm looking at the historic period or 2024 because it's just so totally similar. Spain, yes. In short, I talk about it in the introduction to my book, primarily around kind of Catholicism and rituals of pilgrimage and the different treatment of Mussolini's body versus Franco, but maybe we talk about that at dinner. Oh, that's so heavy.
Sure. All right. I'll be quick too. Again, I think I agree here with this point. It's a sort of demographic ideology as well as it is a racial ideology in the mind of Mussolini. The idea being that there is strength in numbers, right? And it's, of course, some interesting comparisons, right, to all these kind of preoccupations with birth rate that we hear on the right nowadays. I do think I don't know that sort of dooms the Italians to defeat in the Second World War. I think if we look at these new military history as well as the new material history, right, we see that there were some quite spectacular kind of successes and feats in the Second World War with, not just the sort of one of the largest fleets of submarines in the world, but before the Second World War, but among these various sort of special forces, right, who are actually, you know, one person able to sort of sink a ship in Alexandria. And so we could talk more about that. The question of autarky, how it's used, when it's deployed. You know, oftentimes it's deployed as, at least in the case of Mussolini, as quite the liberation of the nation from the slavery of foreign bread, or the liberation of the nation from economic servitude. So again, always with sort of relation to the world and the world order, rather than sort of self-sufficiency or something more sort of benign for its own sake. And so, yeah, continue to think or talk about that one too.
Yeah, no, this is great. So I'm just going to tie all of these together, starting with Renato's question about any trace, you know, what it was the long history of the anti-state tradition that's so prominent in the far right. And I will just say it depends on which far right we're talking about. I mean, each has different. So, you know, if there are plenty of, let's say, Latter-day Saints or Mormons on the far right, you know, Mormonism has a very distinct relationship to the state going back in its history of persecution, as do Jehovah's Witnesses, who build their entire eschatology on one of their leaders leaders who was jailed during World War I for being a conscientious objector, right? So it depends on who we're talking about, but I think they all then come to share a common language that then sort of fuses with Jacksonian populism. It's fascinating. I guess the short answer would be yes. There is. And that gets also to Roberta's point about like, as well as like looking maybe even broadly beyond, if we're looking for fascist affinities, maybe the far right isn't the place to look. And that their affinities in being anti-state, and Wolfgang Schievelbusch has written on this, right? His 3 New Deals about like, if you actually want to see fascist influence in the United States, look at the first New Deal, look at the NRA, the National Recovery Act, look at the public works projects. That's where you see, right? I just want to say in response to Mary and Terrence, forgive me in the brevity and what I was trying to do in this paper if I gave the impression that they are not interested in this worldliness. They absolutely are. I was just trying to think of the longer trajectory. They're playing the eternally long game of politics.
I think we have to go, so I'm not going to say much, but we can talk at dinner. But I'll say that there were some excellent points raised about the role of trans-colonial, trans-imperial discussions. I think what strikes me as someone outside your subfield is that the conversation is still very teleological. It's still very bounded to the Axis world, and it's so fixated on the question of what is different that it doesn't ask what is the same enough, right? That's it.
Thank you so much.